Greetings, this is Chapter 6, Race and Color Discrimination. We are now diving into specific areas covered under the Civil Rights Act that are protected, race and color discrimination, and having a discussion specifically about how race and color and the overlap between the two, there is a large overlap, are treated under the Civil Rights Act and other legislation out there. So we start now with race and color. In the next few chapters, we'll get into the different areas, religion and things like that, that are covered under Title VII. And then we dive into other issues like privacy and disability and stuff like that as well. But we have a whole host of different laws that we're going to cover. Age discrimination as well. That's not specifically covered under the Civil Rights Act, but we will address the ADEA, Age Discrimination and Employment Act, specifically talking about too. So now we get into very specialized areas and case law that supports cases of discrimination and demonstrates where there's discrimination and where there's not. This chapter has 6 learning objectives. Number 1, discuss and give important details on the history of race discrimination and civil rights issues in the United States. So we go into some historical detail. Again, it's really important for you to remember that the laws don't come out of a vacuum, that we don't decide to make a law for no good reason, and that there is a historical buildup and a historical context within which we have to make decisions about whether or not we want to pass laws and other types of policies and regulations that are out there. So it is important that we understand the history, the tone, what was going on at the time, because all of these things influence how we interpret what those laws mean. And that's how we can come to understand why the laws were passed and specifically what Congress's intent was in doing that. Number 2, explain the relevance of the history of civil rights to present-day workplace race and color discrimination. So again, the next step is, now that we understand the history, how does it relate to what we're dealing with now? And particularly some of the challenges that we're facing with Black Lives Matter and the historical discrimination against Blacks and institutional racism and things like that. So it is important that we understand the past history and then how it frames the way we think about race and color discrimination today. Number 3, set forth the findings of several recent studies on race inequalities. And so what we'll do is discuss several recent studies that address, and cases that address, why paying attention to race inequality is still relevant today. Number 4, identify several ways that race and color discrimination are manifested in the workplace. So now we'll start to get into specific case examples, different ways where we see race and color discrimination coming into play. Number 5. Explain why national origin issues have recently been included under race discrimination claims by the EEOC and why they remain different. So we see some blending, right, between race, color, and national origin, and those things have a huge overlap, but they're not 100% overlap. And so while some national origin cases may seem to be relevant to issues of race discrimination, in fact, it needs to be treated as a separate item, and we have to be careful about when they may feel like they're the same, but they actually are different. Lastly, number 6, describe ways in which an employer can avoid potential liability for race and color discrimination. And that's the goal of this course, right? I mean, every chapter is really about how do we avoid problems with race and color discrimination and other areas of discrimination. So here is the wording of the statutes that we should be aware of. And this is all part of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Number 1, to fail or refuse to hire or to discharge any individual or otherwise to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment because of such individual's race, color, or, number 2, to limit, segregate, or classify employees or applicants for employment in such a way which would deprive or tend to deprive any individual of employment opportunities or otherwise adversely affect his status as an employee because of such individual's race and color. And so again, it's about we're not hiring them or we're engaging in some activities that might deprive somebody of opportunities in the workplace. So it's not just about getting the flow of them into the company, but it's also how I sort of manage them or segregate them once they come into the company. And these are the issues that we have to address. So you can see from the language, right, of these laws, they're very dense and they're very word specific. And this is obviously one of the reasons why it takes a long time to write legislation, because we're trying to cross all the T's and dot all the I's and make sure we've covered all the loopholes that we figured we can come up with. And so that's why you see, would deprive or would tend to deprive. So it's not enough to just say deprive, but we have to expand it to say, well, it might deprive or it could deprive. So details. So let's get a nice overview or an introduction, really, to the issues in this chapter. Number one, you should know that race is the first of the prohibited categories in Title VII. So it talks about race, color, national origin, religion, and gender or sex. I think that it used to be called sex. Now, because we're including gender identity in it, it's expanded to include gender. Um, so race is really what the purpose of the legislation was in the first place. It was to have a comprehensive set of legislation that was going to try to remedy the historical discrimination, remove Jim Crow and other issues that were going on for Black Americans during the Jim Crow days in the early 1900s. The Southern Poverty Law Center, though, even in 2011 shows that hate groups are rising to over 1,000 active hate groups. And this was in 2011. It's even more so now, I'm certain. Although I don't have the updated statistics here, but recall also that 2011 is in the midst of Barack Obama's, I believe it was his end of his first term, or it's in the middle of his first term. And so a lot of that came about because we had a black president or a black identified president. And that created this backlash by people who were white supremacists who did not believe that blacks should have the right to be in positions of power like that. The EEOC 2019 stats show that race discrimination still covers 1/3 of all the claims filed. Now imagine, right, that you've got race, age, color, national origin, religion, sex, sexual harassment as a specific subset of that, and a disability, etc. And race still covers 1/3 of the total claims filed. So this tells you, right, that there is a historical problem with race discrimination and othering that occurs, for often, and it's not always purposeful. It can be unintentional, but that unintentional discrimination and unconscious bias is still a relevant issue. There is an enduring impact reflected in the race-related incidents and movements that are going on today in society, looking at, Black Lives Matter and all the protests that happened after George Floyd was killed. This was revolutionary last year in the summer of 2020, where we saw these huge movements where people are just saying enough, we're done. So this idea of being anti-racist and how do we become anti-racist is growing in terms of its influence in terms of race relations and the way that we navigate, a diverse world. So there's been a number of different studies on addressing race inequalities, and we'll talk about each of these items specifically. Number one, employers would rather hire a white man who had not served time in prison than a black man who had not. So assuming that there's no prison involved here, people would still prefer to hire a white man over a black man. And again, we've got plenty of research that's been done on the identical resumes, as you see in point number 2, where anybody that has an ethnic name or what would be perceived or stereotyped as a quote unquote black name, we will still see people choose the white candidate over who they perceive to be the black candidate, even when those resumes are absolutely identical. So yes, employers would prefer to hire a white person over a black person. And this is part of implicit association and implicit biases. We like to, if you understand the perceptual process, you know we like to surround ourselves with people who look like us. I've said this multiple times in the lectures for this class, and I will continue to say it. It is a natural thing for our brains to do to attract us to people who look like us and act like us and feel like who we are. So when we don't address those issues, and we are allow the unconscious decision making to occur rather than being mindful and conscious of that, we create problems for ourselves in the long run. So it is important that we address that. There's also linguistic profiling, where African Americans who leave messages in response to ads often never get return calls, while whites who call do. And there seems to be something about the tone or the linguistics of the way people speak that people assume that someone is black or is not black. Now, that's also a form of a microaggression, right? Because you might be talking to somebody and not get a sense of that linguistic profiling, and when they show up and they're black, it's not uncommon for white folks to say something to the effect of, "Wow, you speak so well for someone who's black," or "I didn't realize you were black from talking to you on the phone." And I don't know why anybody would say that in the first place, but we know that those are the types of microaggressions that people feel. So if you're well spoken, then you transgress what it means to be black. And so there's challenges, of course, with that double bind, right? Often people who speak with different kind of grammar or what have you get assumed to be uppity, and people who are speak more sort of common parlance are thought to be too ghetto, quote unquote. So there's this horrible bind that happens when it comes to linguistic profiling. And in fact, it doesn't matter. What matters is, can someone do the job, right? It doesn't matter linguistically what they sound like. Fundamentally, you want to be able to say, regardless of what someone sounds like or doesn't sound like, they should be able to get the job because they should be able to do the job, based on their skills. The fourth point, serious pay gaps persist along race, gender, and ethnicity. And again, we'll talk about gender and ethnicity in future chapters, but just fundamentally along race, we know there are pay gaps between um, whites and non-whites, that whites still make more money than non-whites do. Other studies on race inequalities. There were some researchers that did a meta-analysis, and what it means, you do an analysis of the results over a wide variety of studies. And then I won't get into the statistics of what that looks like, but you can look at the results of a bunch of different studies and use a statistical tool to analyze to see if there are patterns and themes in the data. So a meta-analysis of every fieldwork experiment of hiring discrimination from 1989 to 2015 was published in the National Academy of Sciences in 2017 showed there has been no change in racial discrimination in hiring since 1989. That pretty much we stagnated in 1989. And the results document a clear, persistent level of racial discrimination in U.S. labor markets, and that blacks are not getting the same opportunities in the workforce to get jobs and retain jobs, because they don't have a culture in the organization that is diverse and allows for diverse opportunities and diverse voices at the table. So there's plenty of evidence in this meta-analysis that shows historical discrimination is still going on. Racial stereotypes and attitudes are heavily influenced the labor market. And so if you're engaging even unconsciously in racial stereotypes and attitudes, whether it's about linguistic profiling or you're making assumptions about ethnic sounding names, fundamentally that's going to influence then the local labor market, who is in the labor market, who gets hired out of that labor market, and who decides to stay in the labor market. If you're not going to get hired, no one's going to give you an opportunity. Why would you stay in the labor market? And so there's part of, a chicken and egg thing, right? Well, like you could say, well, there's no good candidates. Well, when there are good candidates, you don't want to hire them. And so the good candidates leave and they go elsewhere, or they choose to just stay, unemployed. So these are problems that we have to address. These are the things that we as a society have to grapple with. A majority of Americans say racism against blacks is widespread. And I believe that the majority. Now, majority is anything 50% or over. So I do believe that the majority understand this. I'm not sure it's as much of a majority as I would like it to be, but I do think that there are more than 50% of people who believe that racism against blacks is fundamentally widespread. So the definition of race and sort of its relevance when we're talking about Title VII and when we're talking about cases of discrimination, traditionally it's been about African Americans versus whites, right? So, and obviously there are other ethnic groups that are racial groups to be considered, but fundamentally it's been historically African Americans versus whites. That has been the central theme of most of Title VII cases. And it talks about these discrimination of other groups was considered mostly about national origin. But for race, it's really been about black versus white because, again, blacks here in the United States, or African Americans as the term is used in the slide, black folks here in the United States don't have a national origin simply because many of them are not aware of where from Africa they were from or from the Caribbean or wherever else. Some people do know their roots, but not all do. And so people get sort of lumped together. And again, because of slavery, we've destroyed sort of this idea of national origin for anybody who is black. And because they don't know who they're connected to historically, they don't know who their ancestors are going back generations for generations like white people do. And so, it's easier for us to look at Asian Americans. Well, that's a national origin issue, or Latinos. Well, that's also a national origin issue. But African Americans or blacks, it's about who they are fundamentally as black people who are former slaves, who we have challenges in terms of the racial discrimination around that. So we're seeing sort of the EEOC revising this idea of race and national origin. It's acknowledging that there are evolving demographics of interracial families where we have white father, black mother, or black dad, white mother, and there's a multi-dimensional aspect of race. My own children are part Native American, part African American, and part white, all sorts of, ethnic groups, embedded in sort of their white identity. Um, and it's complex for them. On one hand, my daughter has pride in some of her ethnic origins, and in other areas, my son eschews that and says, "I'm not anything but who I am, and all these other issues are just labels that people want to place on me, and it doesn't matter to me." So you can see how people who are multiracial also are trying to define who they are in the way that matters to them. So there are increasing cases of race and color alleging multiple or intersecting biases, like age and gender and national origin. Or you could have a black lesbian who's disabled. So you've got a woman, you've got a sexual minority, you've got a black woman, and you've got someone with a disability. And there are multiple intersecting biases attached to the challenges. So this idea of intersectionality and how intersectionality influences, right, um, how we perceive ourselves and how others perceive us is challenging. And think about Barack Obama. He was intersectional. He had a white mother, he had a black African father, and he identified as black. Although he could have easily have said, "Well, I identify as white because my mother was white, and he was raised by a white woman and white grandparents. Why wouldn't he identify as white?" But he didn't. He identified as black based on what his intersectional identity meant to him. So we have this challenging issue, right, that happens with how I view myself, right, is the multiracial individual, the multidimensional individual. I have an identity. And then I also have the issues of how people perceive me. So even if Barack Obama had perceived himself as white, others would perceive him as black. So it doesn't matter what his own identity is with respect to issues of race and discrimination. It's really how people treat him that is at odds here. And if there's an interesting case here that you should look at is Alonzo versus the Chase Manhattan Bank.